This is the Financing Infrastructure in Africa Roundtable. My name is John McCarthy from The Banker. Around the table today we have Nick Rouse, Managing Director, Frontier Market Fund Managers at Standard Bank, Helen Tarnoy, Commercial Director at Aldwych International, Geoffrey Wynne, Partner at Denton Wild Sapt, Charles Cullimore, Chairman of BABA, and Dr. Nkosana Mayo, Partner Africa at Actis. I'd like to begin today with asking the question, is private capital the answer to all the problems of infrastructure funding in Africa?
Nick Rouse, Managing Director of Frontier Markets Fund Managers. I think private sector capital is a key component. I don't think necessarily it's the only component necessary to develop infrastructure, but I think one finds that where private sector money is not involved, not a lot happens. Even when private sector money is available, sometimes not a lot happens, and no doubt we'll discuss that. I mean, problems in general with getting infrastructure financing underway, when government gets involved in determining electricity prices, which I'm sure Helen will touch on, political considerations come into play, governments lack capacity. We're going to touch on areas of success, I think, on the agenda, where regulatory touch is light. For example, in telecoms, the private sector has been very successful. And telecoms, of course, is the great success story in Africa of infrastructure development. It's interesting to look at why telecoms has been more successful, say, than power or water or some of the other areas. And I think it's very much to do with letting the private sector get on with it and quite a light regulatory touch.
There are those who say that changing management style in Africa will in fact resolve the problem within the public sector. Nkosana, would you like to comment on that?
I'm Nkosana Moyo, a partner with Actis. I would like to start a slightly different place. The first observation would be that infrastructure is a very broad categorization, and I think we probably need to nuance it a little. On the one side, you probably have got something like telecoms, as has been mentioned, and on the other extreme, transport type infrastructure and power maybe. And part of the reason why telecoms has succeeded, I think when you look at the capital requirement and the ability to modularize the investment, you can easily match the consumer base or supply demand issues and the financing required. But as you move up that spectrum towards the sort of more traditional transport power type infrastructure, you face a purely mathematical problem in the sense that the financing required, capital outlay upfront, and your ability to see the consumer base and capacity to purchase from a purely commercial point of view is a challenge, which immediately then brings into play your initial question about, is private sector the answer? And I think the answer is absolutely not. Because I don't think you can deal with the consumer, the supply-demand imbalances as they would appear on the face of things on a purely commercial basis.
Anybody else like to?
My name is Helen Tarnoy. I'm a co-founder and commercial director of Aldwych International. I'm not sure that I entirely agree in respect of the power sector. Historically, the power industry has started as a private venture. You look at the nationalised utilities. They were nationalised utilities. They weren't national utilities in Europe, for example, to start with. So I think it is possible to develop infrastructure, power infrastructure in the private sector. And indeed, recent history suggests that it is even in Africa, where there's been a relatively good, if small, history of privately financed independent power projects. What I do think is a problem for a lot of infrastructure is the short-term political cycle, so that long-term projects that require a longer-term view by the government don't attract too much attention because they're not going to bring political kudos within the 4-year electoral cycle.
I'm Geoffrey Wynne. I'm a banking partner at the international law firm Denton Wild Sapt. It's quite interesting that if you sort of try to summarize the sort of the Africa problem, and that's pretty unfair because it's 52 countries, is that you do get a lot of it as being, well, it's all too difficult. And consequently, anybody who wants very much, as Helen has said, a short-term return it's just not worth it. It's too difficult, it's too risky. And therefore, ultimately, the guys that take a longer term ought to be the donor funds, the multilaterals. Africa's problem is that its internal multilaterals don't have the capacity, financial or otherwise, to support. And we're still very short of the major financing sectors, from IFC to the EIB and so on, being prepared to stand up and take the long-term view.
I'm Charles Cullimore, Chairman of the British Africa Business Association, which is an umbrella group representing the 3 regional business associations in the UK focused on Africa. I think most of the points have been covered, but perhaps I've just been thinking, and I don't quite agree with everything that Nkosana said about the fact the private sector not actually having a major role in infrastructure. If you look at the beginning of the railways, for instance, in the UK, I mean, this was done through private capital. And I think that is one of the problems that Africa, again, one shouldn't generalize, but many African countries have, is the lack of local private capital. So there isn't, that's one bit of the jigsaw that's missing. It isn't there. You can't expect to raise the money from the private sector in African countries because the capital either isn't there or, more seriously, has gone elsewhere out of the country, like it's been invested by those Africans who've been successful outside their own countries. That's an issue that I think needs to be recognised.
We'll certainly come back to issues of access to project finance later, and also to the possible sourcing of money from, let's say, non-traditional sources, Russia, China, India, and so forth. I wonder if I could now throw out the question is...
But before we move on, can I just come back
yes,
to
please do.
A couple of issues? The first thing is that I did not say that the private sector has got no role to play. What I did question is whether it is the answer. I doubt that the private sector is the answer, but I think hopefully later on we'll discuss the issue of public-private sector partnerships, because I think the solution ultimately is got to lie in a combination of how those two can play a role in a supportive way.
Following on from that, why, when we have available large amount of funding from institutions like the World Bank and other institutional finance, why go to the private sector? Why would Africa go to the private sector and in the construction of infrastructure projects when cheaper finance is available through international financial institutions?
I think the private sector represents more than just mobilization of capital. The private sector represents a way of thinking and a way of doing business, the efficiencies of deploying scarce resources. I think that's probably the crux of the matter in terms of why you would not necessarily just deploy capital from DFIs on their own. And in my case, I think the transition, the whole experiment, if you like, of CDC to Actis is a fascinating one. And there's been an incredibly resounding success to prove this point. It's not just access to money. It's how you manage the money with commercial acumen and that efficiency, which I think is the key, why you would do that.
I think it's interesting even in South Africa, one is seeing relatively significant power cuts there historically. I'm sure Eskom would be saying things like the extent to which government suppressed tariff increases and it was politically motivated by not allowing sufficient cash generation for future capex is now coming home to roost a bit more. Been talk of IPPs in South Africa, only now maybe are they really being serious about it?
But you see, again, this issue of overcharging is an interesting one because I think it's got different buckets, at the very least a couple of different buckets. The first one is going to be what everybody recognizes, corruption. In other words, that 60 million which was added, where did it go? How do you account for it? But there is a much more legitimate element which I think we should not ignore, and that's just a question of pricing risk, a perception of the risk and how you price it. Sort of political risk, stability, this issue of on the one side, the world is pushing democracy onto Africa, and you were arguing earlier on that there is no democracy, therefore there is continuity. But actually, the world is saying to Africa, no, you can not continue that way. So you cannot see into the future where that stability is going to be there because the world is pushing Africa the one way. And once you start trying to factor this issue of how do you price that risk from a political perspective, part of that overcharging is going to come precisely from that.
Is there a sense around the table that privately funded projects will be better governed than aid projects or money that is put through government projects? Nick?
Yeah, the funds I look after are owned by 4 governments. My perception is, with due respect to people at DFID, etc., is the civil servants don't understand what it takes to have an effective project. They have funds available, but they don't know what a good project looks like. That's one of the things the private sector brings.
Civil service amongst the donors, or amongst
amongst the donor countries. And I extrapolate this to I meet with the Swedes and the Dutch, etc. They have good intentions and they are good at issues of sort of governance and applying environmental risk standards and all this kind of thing. But what it takes, what a management team that can run a project well looks like, what an appropriate funding package looks like, what the actual commercial difficulties around a project are, they're really out of their depth once you get into that sort of area.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Nick, but I also think there tends to be a lack of institutional capability in the African ministries that have to administer these big infrastructure projects. And one area where I think emphasis should be laid within the context of a public-private partnership is providing donor funding for advisors to government, because that would go a long way to preventing the sort of rapaciousness that Kosana referred to. So if you've got professional advisors sitting alongside the government, checking what's being done, making sure that financially, technically, commercially, it's a reasonable deal on both sides. First of all, of course, you get a better deal for the consumer in the country, and secondly, you get a more sustainable project. The project doesn't risk the sort of fallout that we've seen, not in Africa, admittedly, but in South America and in the Far East. So I think that's a very important role for the public funding to play, is to provide advisors for the government to support them in the negotiations.
I wonder if that might be an appropriate time to move on to public-private partnerships. If somebody could perhaps outline the problems that we see in that.
Well, I think actually the comment about the public sector or government, and if you do not understand how projects work, is a fascinating starting point or segue into that debate. Mm. I have to say my position is a slightly different one. I think your statement is correct. The public sector probably does not understand the operations of the private sector, but I think the other half of the complete picture is that neither does the private sector understand why sometimes the public sector appears to take a view which is much broader than a pretty micro-focused private sector approach. And a fascinating, I think, starting point is to look at a private sector entity like a company with different functions in it, marketing, manufacturing, and so on and so on. And you often find that the people who sit within a particular function, who don't have an overall sort of umbrella view of the total organization, will take a completely different view to what the health of the total entity should look like and what actually constitutes the total health of an entity. And I think we need to be a bit more empathetic to the fact that the public sector tends to be macro in its approach and looks at the totality. And often, I think we in the private sector are so short-termistic in our approach that we often don't consider, in fact, socio-political stability, which compromises medium to long term the viability of our own projects.
Beyond the general different perceptions on how private financing ought to work, is there a sense in which the limited experience with public-private partnerships in Africa is a negative, that people are not technically skilled enough in putting together projects of this nature?
Well, I think one needs to recognise that PPPs are very complex. They are. You can see it in the amount of documentation, this whole capacity issue. I think the DFIs there is grant money around for capacity building, or certainly to supply lawyers, etc., on an ad hoc basis. But they are very complicated, and Uncle Salah may know a little better than me, but I think only South Africa has really developed a comprehensive set of guidelines for dealing with PPPs. I mean, other African countries are using the South African guidelines as a benchmark, I think, or as a basis for running PPPs. But there's capacity to deal with what are very complex legal documents and contractual arrangements is, it's a real difficulty.
If we could just draw a line under that public-private partnership item for now, and take a 5-minute break and come back and start off with access to project finance. If we could begin again with access to project finance, and I'm thinking here particularly maybe we can begin with the capacity of local markets to provide the necessary capital. Who would like to identify that as a problem? And
can I? It's Nick Rouse. Shall I start? Certain markets do have capacity to provide long-term finance. So in the business Garanco that I manage, we've just agreed to provide a guarantee for a 9-year bond in Tanzania, which will use Tanzanian shillings. And possibly Kenya could do slightly longer. There are pension funds and insurance companies in a lot of these countries with long-term funds available. What they can't do is look at credit risk. They have no capacity to look at credit risk, and guarantee mechanisms are a way to unlock that local finance. Having said that, clearly the size of these funds in the context of the need in Africa for infrastructure funding is relatively limited amounts, and you have to look to outside for the predominance of these projects.
Jeffrey, did you have an angle?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nick's comment, is that there are plenty of countries, and I mean, East Africa seems to have sorted itself out in some ways better than other parts. So Uganda, Charles, you were talking about, Uganda has a very good capital markets authority, has a thriving way of raising funds locally with the insurance companies and the pension funds. So that's there, but I don't see that the lack of the size of funds is a problem. The fact of the matter is that you need international funding, and it's how to direct the international funding. I mean, that's what will make projects viable. I don't think it matters whether there is local funding available or not. The other part is, of course, that if the funding is international, is provided in dollars or whatever, then you need to be able to gauge your return in dollar terms. And that's a bigger problem, is that if the local currency is depreciating and therefore the payments for any project are made in local currency, there's a shortfall. And I think Helen will probably say that one of the solutions was very easy, is that you dollar price power. I mean, that's how you can compensate on that side, and then someone's got to work out how to cover the shortfall.
Is that right?
That's traditionally been the approach, yes. And it's an approach, frankly, that has always given us some cause for concern, because pricing your power purchase agreement in dollars, if there is a currency collapse, really means that you don't have a sustainable project any longer. And we've seen that very noticeably in South America, Brazil, also in the Far East. And I think one of the recent interesting developments that I'm sure Nick is familiar with too is a new product which is being developed by the European DFIs to hedge that currency risk, to enable power purchase agreements to be denominated in the local currency. And the view that they've taken is that if they provide that facility to a sufficient number of projects, they will self-hedge. That portfolio of projects will enable them to hedge this risk. And we think that's a very, very exciting development because, you see the power purchase agreements in Tanzania, Uganda, they're all dollar denominated, and that becomes dominant, and there is a risk in there that has to be managed somehow.
There's an issue about local currency. I think long-term local currency is available. One issue about local currency financing is, whilst it covers your currency risk because you're financing in local currency, you substitute in the project interest rate risk for currency risk. There's very limited fixed rate lending in these countries. There are no yield curves to work off. So you're generally looking at variable rates.
Nkosana, how do you see this problem, and what are the avenues for resolving this?
Firstly, I think I'm in Jeff's space in the sense that local currency in principle is there in different countries, but when you look at the scale of the task at hand, I think most countries, maybe other than possibly Nigeria now with the recapitalized banks in South Africa, and then maybe some countries in North Africa, the local resources are nowhere near what is required to actually tackle the issue. Therefore, I think you cannot get away from looking at global capital markets of one description or other in terms of the scale of the issue.
May I just broaden this out just a little beyond finance so that we incorporate one or two other things? One of the problems with infrastructure investments, of course, is that they are, or have been in the past, particularly prone to political and regulatory interference, and have also been subject to fairly high transaction and submission costs. How do those problems relate to the difficulty in accessing finance as well?
Please, before answering, can I just use the Maputo corridor as a good example? Because part of the challenge is when we're talking about infrastructure, it tends to be state-bound. In other words, you're looking at a particular country. And your challenge is, as we've just said, mobilizing capital, which is domestic, but not enough. And then you go and mobilize international finance for returns which are then going to be denominated primarily in local currency, the mismatches that you create. But I think the Maputo corridor is a very illustrative, or possibly shed some light on what you could do. Start looking at infrastructure on a regional basis. Although actually the revenues, strictly speaking, are domestic, but you create trading flows which then probably create the capacity to service external debt, and you can deal with it. I mean, it's a road in South Africa, it's a road in Mozambique. It allows the trade traffic to happen and the economic activity to take care of those issues.
I think Nkosana's point is actually a particularly important one. Obviously, it would only apply to certain projects, particularly, I guess, transport, roads, railways, and power, I suppose also, yes, to have a regional element as far as possible, not just because of the obvious economic benefits of that, but also because of the political benefits, I guess. If you have more governments signed up and committed to it, it makes it harder for one particular government or its successor, which might be a sort of rogue government, to cause difficulties, because it will have difficulties with its neighbours.
I think also it's, you mentioned in power, it allows projects to be done that are important regionally, but perhaps individually not today sustainable, not financeable. So if you think of big interconnected projects within the nascent power pools, by themselves, those projects are huge. And today there may not be the capacity, either the generating capacity at one end or the consuming capacity at the other, to justify them. But if they can be financed in a PPP structure, which is the way they are going to be done, then they are sustainable and they have the political support, and no government is going to turn off its end of the power transmission line, one sincerely hopes.
In the context of multilateral agreements, to what extent are organisations such as the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and their guarantees important for projects? I'm thinking in particular of the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency and related types of mechanisms. Nick?
Well, MEGA clearly is, their support is very helpful. In the marketplace, the general perception of MEGA is that it's very bureaucratic and very slow, and so isn't actually terribly commercial.
I mean, you use MEGA as an example. I think the World Bank family of institutions are very useful. They've got incredible convening capacity, but they don't use it anywhere near what they could do. Partly because when you look at the numbers, the population of employees within those systems tends to be much more from the public sector than from the private sector, people who actually sort of roll their sleeves up and understand operationally what is supposed to be done. I think that's where the bureaucracy and slowness comes from. But having said that, I think they still have got incredible capacity. And it's not even, you could almost argue that the premiums that they pay are completely way over the top, in the sense that the protection they have is much more of a perceived. It's just because of who they are. They afford you the protection.
Nick Rouse. Yeah.
Sorry, Nick Rouse. I think they argue that they've only ever had one claim, meagre. It's incredibly small because, of course, this is the World Bank, and who can fall out with the World Bank? So having them involved is a very great mitigant. You know, wherever you see it in a credit situation.
I would agree. I think it's almost indispensable still today, and I do think, to be fair to the bank as a group, that they are making efforts to reduce the bureaucracy and to make themselves more user-friendly. It's a struggle, but they are trying very hard. I also think one of the encouraging signs is that they're beginning to move out of their ivory tower in Washington and setting up regional offices. They've done that at IFCs in Johannesburg, also in Nigeria. And I think having people on the ground and really having a much closer feel for the projects that they're trying to help finance is extremely positive. So we would hope to see more of that going forward.
On that note, I'm sure there's much more to be said on that subject. I wonder, we talked somewhat earlier about political risks and how those might be priced, avoided, mitigated. I wonder if we could outline what you see as some of the key political risks and how we go about navigating those.
There's this wonderful perception problem that Africa has. There are some exceptions of government interference and indeed expropriation. And sort of Zimbabwe is probably a
Say no more.
on that. But well, one hopes unique. But Africa's problem, the continent's problem, is that there actually have not been that sort of level of defaults that you've had in South America we were talking about. So there's a perception, and I suspect the insurance market is itself actually not too averse to ensuring expropriation risk on that. So I think that care in some ways needs to be taken. Those of us who work on the continent would probably say that that's a pretty low risk, but the perception that it might happen is what the problem is about getting projects done.
I wonder if we could move on to talk about some of the individual countries in Africa. In particular, which do you see as having the most attractive policies towards infrastructure investment, and what is the government's role in those projects? And Kasona, perhaps you'd like to kick us off on that.
Comes back to this capacity issue. I suppose the only country where I know they've made some headway in this area is South Africa. I'm not sure that there is any other way I would say. I mean, South Africa and Mozambique is benefited from just being a smart sort of partnering with South Africa, and I think there is a better understanding of what can happen. There is a track record, and they're improving as they go along, next generation and so on. But any other African country that's that way advanced, I'm not sure. But that's not to say that they're not.
Ghana,
Jeffrey.
Kenya. Kenya's had some successful IPPs. Ghana has an environment that is conducive.
Perhaps I could use that as a segue into drawing in the new actors in the investment domain. I'm thinking in particular about China, India, Russia. What impact will their entry into the African financing of projects make, positively and negatively? Helen, come on.
Thank you for putting me on the spot. I think it's a very interesting question. China is an investor in various sectors in Africa already. There's been a perception that their investment is not always done in a manner which the rest of us would naturally support. There are issues about labour laws, there are issues about environmental observation and so on. I think, nevertheless, that there is a willingness on the part of Chinese investors to work with international financing institutions to try to understand where these differences come from and how to resolve them. And we know that the EIB, for example, the European Investment Bank, has a positive policy towards engaging Chinese investors in Africa in order to get them to work together to develop projects that are sustainable.
I think on balance, a very good thing. So I don't know about Russia and its involvement in Africa, but China and India, I think the first thing to look at if you take China is to firstly look at what's happening within China itself. I think China is doing an experiment where it's moving its own practices more and more into the commercial space. Yeah? And the other important thing about China is all of this debate about public-private partnerships. China Inc., I mean, it's like most of the Eastern economies, the two work hand in glove. And so the private sector operators going into Africa, those who are there, I mean, a lot of them are actually public sector entities that are going into Africa. I think are always going to be careful what they do, because if they annoy their own government, they can be brought to book back in China. And I think there is a supervision mechanism implied in those relationships which can actually do good for Africa.
I've been John McCarthy. Thank you for listening to this roundtable brought to you